Hello everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's an absolute pleasure to join you all, and I'm so enjoying listening to the talks already, and I know I'm going to enjoy the rest of them for the rest of the day, and it's so interesting how they all tie together, little snippets we can all take home from each other's presentations. So I'm going to talk for the next few minutes about quite specific companion animals, which are retired greyhounds, and of course those are dogs who start their lives as athletes, not really as companions at all, but at the time at which they retire, undergo for them what is quite a dramatic switch into becoming a companion animal. The work which I'm about to present, a lot of it was undertaken by a student of mine, Maxwell Charteris, when I was at the Royal Veterinary College, and it ties in also, as you'll see, with some of the work being done by the Greyhound Board of Great Britain, the GBGB, within their welfare strategy. And just to be absolutely transparent in my declaration of interest, I am presenting this both as an independent director of the GBGB and the person who wrote their welfare strategy, and with my academic hat on through the University of Nottingham. So the GBGB has a long-standing commitment to the principle that wherever possible, every greyhound should have a long and happy and healthy retirement. Typically, for those of you who aren't familiar with the world of racing greyhounds, they retire at about 4 or 5 years of age, and they're quite long-lived dogs, so they have a long period in which they could enjoy a good life ahead of them at the point of retirement. And what we're trying to do is to ensure that all of them can do that, because it can be quite challenging for them to switch from the life of an athlete into a domestic environment. So the study which Maxwell undertook was trying to elucidate factors which negatively impact on an individual greyhound's chance of being offered a home, or increase their chances of being sent back to the homing centre having initially been offered a home. And then the reason we were trying to do all of this is that if we can understand those factors, then we can develop policies for mitigating them and trying to improve the lives for these retiring greyhounds. The background against which this research was undertaken, just to make you aware of the context, is that in the UK we've had a horrible perfect storm going on for the last 18 months or so. Touches upon what Dr. Doherty was saying about the impact of COVID. We had a lot of people who took animals out of homing centres when they weren't at work and then wanted to give them back when they went back to work. A lot of those people, as Dr. Doherty said, were not very well educated in the needs of an animal, and so a lot of the dogs they wanted to give back were those that had developed behavioural problems because they weren't being appropriately looked after. And then combined with all of that, we've got a real cost of living crisis going on in the UK at the moment, so some people are really struggling to provide for their animals and having to take them to homing centres. So the greyhound need for homing, which is an annual one, because a certain number of dogs retire each year, is sitting within this larger context of a kind of crisis in homing canids in the UK. The study designed for the work which Maxwell undertook, you can see here, we basically had 9 British greyhound homing organisations who participated in semi-structured interviews, and they range from small centres who work primarily via fostering to some large national organisations, and some of those larger organisations in particular work with breeds other than just greyhounds. And you can see that the responses were analysed thematically, and that we obviously had consent and approval for it. What you can see here on the slide, and I know it's going to be hard to read, but you can hopefully find the slides afterwards, is simply what the questions were that they were asked in those semi-structured interviews. And you can see that there were some quantitative ones about how many dogs they typically home each year, how long they think the typical dog spends in their homing centre, what percentage get successfully rehomed, and so forth. And then there were more qualitative questions about the factors which they thought were like the people running the homing centres, I'm talking about these experts running the homing centres, thought either impacted a greyhound's chance of being offered a home to start with, or made the greyhound more likely to be brought back to the centre having initially been taken to a domestic home. So just to give you a run through some of the results, you can see the quantitative results here. The numbers which were homed from the organisations varied according to their size. The percentage of greyhounds they reported as being successfully homed was high, actually, in comparison to homing rates for dogs generally, and was round about 98, 100%, or some other description of 100% around that. The average time in the homing centre, and this was undertaken over a year ago now, so it may have changed a little bit since, because we're still having all these problems at home. at that time was reported to be between about 1 and 3 months. And interestingly, that's broadly comparable to the time which other breeds spend in homing centres, as reported by the RSPCA in the UK. But all of the centres reported that there was variability with individual dogs. 6 months was considered a long time. And all of the centres reported that, yes, they did sometimes have greyhounds returned to them. And we know from the literature that that's also true of other breeds. Typically, somewhere between 7 and 20% of dogs get returned to a homing centre having been homed. So what were the barriers to homing a greyhound, and what can we do about them? This was the kind of crux of the research. Some of them, the barriers to homing a greyhound, are exactly the same as we see to barriers to homing other dogs, and go back to what Dr. Doherty was just saying, which I was really interested by. So some of them are physical factors. Size, large dogs generally harder to home than small dogs. Colour, with greyhounds, as with other dogs, being black in colour is not a popular thing for people looking for dogs to home, and that may be simply that it's a very common colour and people want something a bit unusual, or it may be that black is quite hard to photograph. And this photograph is actually quite well set up because it's been done against a light coloured background, but if you photograph a dark dog against a dark background, you can't really see its face. So if people are scrolling through a website somewhere, they're unlikely to kind of focus on that dog. Male dogs generally harder to rehome than female, but with greyhounds that may also relate to size, because the dogs are typically quite a bigger than the bitches, and grey faces people don't like even if the dog is actually quite young. And then there were a raft of behavioural factors for greyhounds, which are the same as those for other dogs, very similar to what Dr. Doherty just described. Failure to interact with potential homers when they come round the centres, whether or not the dog's house trained, how well it's socialised, separation anxiety, and whether it's showing aggression. I'll talk a little bit more about aggression in a moment. Interestingly, greyhounds are actually more likely than other shelter dogs to pass an initial temperament test with humans. Some of the barriers to homing greyhounds, however, are specific to greyhounds, and these are ones which GB as an organisation can really try to do something to mitigate. And the lead one of all of those, which won't surprise you, of course, is the high prey drive, and that kind of ties into aggression. Well, what is actually a high prey drive in greyhounds, and a perfectly normal innate characteristic, is sometimes interpreted by people as aggression. So the fact that they are driven to chase a small dog, for example, people think that's aggressive behaviour. It's not exactly aggression, really. It's just their natural instinct, but it is nonetheless problematic, undoubtedly. And there's also definitely a lot of misconception amongst potential homers about a greyhound's requirements. They assume because they are athletes, they are very high-energy dogs who are going to need an awful lot of exercise. And actually, because they're primarily sprint athletes, it's far from the truth, and they're quite happy to have 2 20-minute walks a day and lie around the rest of the time. Some of the reasons greyhounds get returned, having initially been offered a home, are exactly the same as they are for some other breeds, and many of them, of course, overlap with the reasons they're not offered a home to begin with. So aggression is one of the reasons people state for taking a greyhound back. As I said, part of that is actually to do with prey drive, but there is a particular thing around being startled when they're asleep. Greyhounds, for some reason, seem to sleep particularly deeply. Maybe it's because they're athletes, I don't know. And so if people interact inappropriately with them when they're asleep, they kind of awake with a great judder and can then appear to be aggressive. So that's something which owners definitely need to be educated about. Reactivity to other dogs, typically small dogs, but sometimes larger ones. One of the things that was given as a reason for people bringing them back was that they felt they were uncuddly compared to other breeds, which I have to say I find perverse, because the 2 greyhounds I've had have been extremely cuddly. But separation anxiety, as with other breeds, destructive behaviours. And then there were a whole raft of reasons given for bringing greyhounds back, which were nothing to do with the dog at all, but all to do with the owners. For example, jogs or allergies or divorce or financial trouble, moving house, and the pandemic. But some of the reasons greyhounds get returned are specific, again, to them being greyhounds, and again, top of that list is prey drive. And it's not surprising, I mean, I know, having had 2 greyhounds myself, that it is frustrating sometimes to be having to walk a dog on the lead when it's very clear that what the dog wants to do is having a massive run around. And I was very interested. There's someone who lives in the country and can walk out my back door and never has my dog on the lead, because we live in a 6,000-acre forest. It was very interesting to hear what you had to say, actually, about the need for dogs to be on leads in urban environments nowadays. So maybe it's not so different from greyhounds, from other breeds, but I think people do find it sometimes difficult to deal with. And the people working in the homing centres definitely felt that a large part of people bringing dogs back was that they had taken the dogs on with unrealistic expectations or with a lack of understanding of the challenge which a greyhound faces when it goes into a home environment, despite the homing centres having tried their very best to explain that to them. So there's some clearly work to be done there. People were thinking the dogs would be fully trained within a few weeks and thinking they would just kind of settle into a domestic environment without any problems. So what can we do about all of this? How can we, first of all, encourage people to consider having a greyhound at all, because quite often people don't because they have these misconceptions about them, and how can we encourage them to consider having a particular greyhound who's sitting in one of the homing centres? Well, there's obviously a large piece to be done around education, around the fact they don't need a massive amount of exercise, around the fact they're actually very healthy dogs, particularly compared to some of the pet breeds you were just talking about. You're unlikely to end up with enormous vet's bills for an inherited dog in a greyhound. So that's something that's good for people to be aware of. Although they are large dogs, they're typically not actually very expensive dogs to keep. You talked about social media. Of course, there's a big use for that. I was lucky enough to spend some time in Tasmania just over these last few days, and they have a huge greyhound rehoming program there, centrally organised, which was just so impressive. And they make good use of Facebook groups, for example, so that homers get peer support. They've really engaged with the local community, so that they've got activities going on with the people who own greyhounds. Interestingly, they've developed greyhound-only dog parks, where they can take the greyhounds and they can all run off the leash and have fun together. So all of that kind of stuff really helps people to get used to the idea of these athletes also being companion animals at a certain stage of their lives when they go into retirement. And certainly facilitating initial meetings in the homing environment, which are not with the dog kind of in its actual kennel, but are in an open space when people can really get to see the dog's character more and not just focus on its physical attributes like its colour. I think that's also an important factor. One of the things we're very aware of is the need to make this transition easier for greyhounds and thereby reduce the return rate and make it more likely that when people talk to other people about when they've got a greyhound or a retired greyhound, how did that go, they will get a positive feedback about that. You can see here on the screen Dr. Sarah Heath. She's also one of the world's leading veterinary behaviourists, and she's very kindly working as an independent expert with the GB at the moment around this whole issue. And the work she's doing is basically broken into two phases. First of all, we've been thinking about what we could do very early in a greyhound's life, which will make that transition at the point at which it retires easier for it. And there is certainly work which needs doing around familiarising with domestic objects, for example, sofas, stairs, vacuum cleaners, all of those things which seem obvious to us, but if you've always spent your life in a kind of racing kennel environment, you've never seen them before. And also socialising with other breeds and training to alleviate separation anxiety and so forth, training to walk on a lead properly and not to just be walking in a bounding enthusiasm as you go up to the start of a race. And we started off, and I think Sarah started off from talking to her by thinking, right, what we need to do is very early in the dog's lives, before they go into the racing kennels, when they're in the rearing phase of their lives, to get them used to all of that stuff. And then when they retire, they will already be used to it and life will be easy. But so now that Sarah's actually spent some time at the rearing facilities where the dogs spend their lives in the early stages, and typically they are in big pens with quite large dogs running around at that stage, and then in kennels, I think she's slightly changed her view on that from what she's told me, because that setup actually provides a smooth transition into the racing kennels for the greyhounds. That's not a big shock to them. And I think what Sarah's started to think is, oh, hang on a minute, actually, if we do too much of this getting used to the domestic environment early on, then when they go into the racing kennels, that's also going to be a drama for them, and then they're going to have another drama when they come out the other end. So what she's working on at the moment is how we can kind of streamline that and minimise the stress at each stage, but also make the retirement transition easier for them. Fostering, I think, is a really interesting idea, and that was just mentioned in the last talk. Certainly in Tasmania, they seem to have quite a big programme around that, and I can see there would be advantages in having the first domestic home which a greyhound goes to being the home of someone who's very used to greyhounds coming out of racing, who understands their needs, who can help them with that adaptation. And when they've done that, then the dogs could go on to a permanent home, perhaps with someone a little bit less experienced. And then the other part of work which Sarah's doing is around a standardised assessment at the point of retirement, so that we would pick up early on the few greyhounds, because they're not huge numbers, there is a few of them, but there are some who are going to need extra support with that transition, and refer them for specialised veterinary behavioural support at that stage, in the hope that they then will go to a good home, well prepared, and not be taken back again. And then, as we said, I suspect the theme we're going to end up with by the end of today around everything is education, education, education. The need for ongoing support, both from organisations but also from peers and homers. So I couldn't leave you out a picture of my first retired greyhound. This is Bertie the greyhound, who did frequently go off the lead, I have to confess. And this is me in Tasmania last week with my friend's greyhound Fee, who they've recently offered a home to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, that was fantastic. I'm just going to open the floor up for questions. We have time for a couple of questions.
Hi, you mentioned separation anxiety. So the training for that, when are they suffering from separation anxiety? Is it from the puppy into the kennel? Or?
No, at the stage of retirement, typically it's one of the reasons people give for taking on a greyhound and then giving it back again. Generally, because at that stage they're typically in a house by themselves with the owners, and then the owners are going out for part of the day. Whereas as long as they're in the kind of rearing or racing environment, actually they're in quite a routine. And very often, at least in the UK, I actually don't know whether it's the same here or not, but very often in the UK they actually are kennelled with a kennel mate. So they've always got company and they've got their routine. So it's the retirement phase at which, if it's not properly managed, the separation anxiety becomes a problem. And I mean, you would know much better than I, but I said probably most of the training around that would be the same for a greyhound as for other breeds. Yeah.
So, yes, you mean in terms of rehabilitating a dog?
Well, yes, when a homer takes on a greyhound, they need to behave in a certain way in order not to induce separation anxiety, I'm guessing. Yeah.
Yes, and what I've seen in the cases that have come to me of separation anxiety, owners expect, this is an adult dog,
yeah.
So they expect the dog to just fit straight into the human lifestyle, and it absolutely needs to be addressed in the same way as any other case of separation anxiety, yeah. But it can be very extreme. I've seen some really difficult to treat cases of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, that was a great talk. Do you think there might be more greyhounds that don't stay in the home, but the owners, the guardians, are reluctant to let the shelter know? So I've done some work with online relinquishments, Facebook, all of those other places they might go.
What, they're not taking them back to the homing centre they got them from? Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
They don't know that they're actually.
Yes. I mean, I suppose it's possible. I mean, I don't know a kind of numbers answer to that. I suppose it's possible. In the UK, at least, we have quite a good tracking system at that first stage, and they are certainly, the owners are always told if they have any problems, they must bring the dog back to that homing centre, and they will be offered support, and the dog will be taken back. Absolutely. But it's always possible, I suppose. Yeah.
Sorry. Hi. So just in terms of the rehoming crisis, because similarly here in New Zealand, like the UK, we were suffering that for many of the same reasons. And when we talk about some of the mitigations in terms of companion animals and breeding, we talk about a lot about desexing and reducing the source of the problem.
Yeah.
Is that something that the industry is looking at in terms of population management, so that more animals aren't being bred than can be responsibly rehomed? Yeah,
absolutely. So on the desexing issue, all of them going out of the homes are neutered before they go. And in fact, the expectation is that if, in the UK, I'm talking about because I don't know about other jurisdictions, that at the point at which the owner of a racing greyhound presents it to a homing centre, and many of those are funded through the Greyhound Retirement Scheme by the GBGB, they will have had it neutered when it goes into, that's their responsibility if they want the dog to be rehomed. It has. But I understand what you're saying is, are there more dogs coming in than are going out? And yes, that is absolutely something which is being discussed on an ongoing basis. And possible ways in which, in which the organisation of the sport of greyhound racing can be, how can I best, it can be changed, I suppose, to best match the number coming in with the number going out is absolutely something that is an issue of active discussion. It's a bit harder when something like this happens and suddenly you've got a lot fewer homes being offered than you expected, but you're quite right, to be sustainable, and that's something we'll be talking about at ISIS next week, that is exactly the position we need to be in, yeah.
Okay, we've just got our last question.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of families in New Zealand which they live with animals, and I wanted to understand how their animals, the dogs and human, understand each other. And hopefully one of the families I studied was a family who have 2 greyhounds. Oh. And what's unique in these families, I found that the human owner, the human guardian, learned a lot about the culture of that animals, to respect the background of the animal. In compared to other families, because when they had a greyhound in the family, they know that's a racing dog, and from the point of the view of the dog, I see that the dog, when they come to the family, they have no awareness of the family life. So when they move around, they bump everything fell down. They're scared, as you said, as vacuum cleaner, they're scared of the baby crying, and they slowly, and the human also understand this. And they recognize the culture of their animals, which is something great, which is unique to these families. I like to know about your point of view. As you said, you work a lot to make the animal ready for the family life. But this is also the awareness that the humans need. And also other owners could learn from these owners, which the background of their animals is very important, how they find their life with their new human.
Yeah, absolutely, and you're quite right, and it's really nice to hear that the owners were, or the new owners were, aware of that. And if I just go back a couple of slides, you're right. It's the animals need prepared, but the homers need to be prepared as well. And one of the things that's being done here I know in Australia as well, and also in Great Britain, is providing these kind of welcome packs for people who are about to take on a greyhound, which explains exactly where they've come from, what they're used to, how you need to care for them. It has bits about separation anxiety, about nutrition and exercise and so forth. So there's a huge education piece there, definitely. Good to know it's working somewhere.
Please join me in thanking Madeleine for coming over. Thank you. Here is a little gift. Thank you very much.